Montana Territory, September 1883. The wind carried the first bite of autumn through the Bitterroot Valley as Yates Lanton buried his hands deeper into the pockets of his worn coat, eyes fixed on the train pulling into the Hamilton depot. Smoke curled above the engine, rising like a ghost into the gray sky. He did not want to be here. He had not wanted to write the letter, and he sure as hell did not want to meet the woman who stepped off that train in a pale blue dress now, holding a carpetbag tight to her chest. She looked too small for this place, frail, maybe like she would break against the wind. But she stood tall, her chin high, eyes scanning the platform. She looked determined. That was something. "Yates Lanton?" she asked, stepping up to him. Her voice was soft, but not timid. Her eyes were the color of smoke and steel, steady, even if her hands trembled just a little. "I am." He did not offer more. "I am Odessa Parlow." She pulled her shoulders back. "Your wife. If that is still your wish." He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw clenched. "Let's get you out of the cold." They rode in silence. His wagon creaked along the dirt road, past pine-thick hills and golden fields gone quiet for winter. Odessa sat beside him, hands folded in her lap, her bag between her boots. She did not ask questions. She did not fill the air with chatter or try to smile too much. That helped. The ranch came into view, fences mended by his own hands, the barn leaning just a little too far west, the house plain but sturdy. Smoke rose from the chimney. The children would be inside, drawing at the table or staring out the window for the stranger he warned them about. "Two of them," he said finally. "They lost their mama 3 years ago." Odessa turned toward him, her voice gentle. "How old?" "Ruth is 5. Reed is 7. She nodded. "I understand." He stopped the wagon and climbed down. She waited for him to come around before stepping down. He did not touch her. He did not offer help. She did not ask for it. Inside, Ruth was clinging to her doll, cheeks pink from the fire's warmth. Reed sat stiff-backed in the chair, watching Odessa like she might grow horns. "This is Miss Odessa," Yates said. "She will be living here now." Odessa knelt down slowly, skirt folding around her knees. "Hello, Ruth." "Hello, Reed. I am glad to meet you." Reed narrowed his eyes. "Are you our new mama?" Odessa blinked, then looked to Yates. "I am here to take care of you," she answered, not lying, but not pushing either. The boy nodded once. Ruth stood and handed her the doll. "You can hold her." Yates stood by the door, arms crossed. He did not move until Odessa looked up at him and smiled, not big, not bright, but warm. Caught him off guard. He turned away. That night, he could hear her footsteps in the kitchen as she cleaned up after dinner. She had made stew with what little was left in the larder, and it had tasted better than anything he had cooked in a year. The children were asleep. The house was quiet. He sat on the porch, watching the moon rise over the trees. Odessa came out, wrapped in a shawl. "You do not talk much," she said, sitting beside him. "I said what needed saying." She nodded, looking out into the dark. "You loved her." He said nothing. "She died in childbirth?" He swallowed hard. "Ruth came early. It was a hard winter." "I am sorry." He stood up suddenly. "I do not want love. You should know that. I asked for a wife because the children needed someone. Not me." She looked up at him, her eyes steady. "I did not come here expecting your heart, Mr. Lanton." He nodded once and went inside, leaving the door open behind him. In the weeks that followed, the house changed. Slowly. Odessa did not push her way in. She moved like someone who knew how to tread lightly. She scrubbed the floors, patched clothes, baked bread from scratch. Ruth began following her everywhere. Reed took longer, but one afternoon he let her mend his shirt without complaint. That night, he asked her to sit by the fire and read aloud. Yates watched all of it from a distance. His hands stayed busy mending fences, tending the horses, chopping wood, but his eyes always drifted back home. She never stepped into his bedroom. She slept in the room where his late wife's sister used to stay. She never asked about the woman in the grave behind the barn. But once, when Ruth asked where her real mama was, Odessa knelt with her beside the marker and placed a wildflower there. She was loved, Odessa whispered. She always will be. When Odessa rose, Yates was standing nearby. Their eyes met. He wanted to thank her, but the words would not come. Snow began to fall in October. Odessa moved through the house like she had always been there. She taught Ruth how to sew a button and helped read with his letters. At night, Yates listened to her voice as she read by the fire, something settling in his chest that he had not felt in years. One evening, he came in with a cut across his palm. The wire fence had snapped back on him. Odessa took his hand without hesitation, cleaned the wound, and wrapped it with firm, gentle fingers. Her head was bent close to his. Her breath brushed his skin. "You should be more careful," she said, looking up at him. He stared at her face, her quiet strength, her kindness. Something ached in him. "I do not know how to care for someone again," he said, the words rough. "You already do," she answered softly. He pulled his hand back and left the room. The blizzard hit hard in early November. A storm like that could kill a man if he was out too long. Yates had gone to check the horses and the snow came down faster than expected. Odessa paced by the window, her worry plain. The children were curled up by the fire. She wrapped herself in every warm layer she could find and stepped out into the storm. She found him half a mile from the barn, one hand gripping a post, half frozen. She got him inside, dragged him to the fire, pulled off his coat, his boots, his gloves. She pressed blankets around him, her body flush against his to share heat. "You fool," she whispered, her cheek against his chest. "You do not get to die too." When he woke, her hand was in his. Her eyes were full of tears. "I thought I lost you," she said. He reached up and touched her face. "I am sorry." "For what?" "For keeping my heart buried with her." Odessa's lip trembled, but she smiled. He sat up, pulled her close, and kissed her for the first time, slow, quiet, full of everything he had not dared to feel. "I do not want to be alone anymore," he said. "You are not," she whispered. And in that moment he knew. His heart had thawed, and it belonged to her. The storm passed, leaving the land glazed in white and quiet. The stillness afterward felt heavier than the wind had, like the world had paused to take stock of what remained. Yates stood at the edge of the porch, boot soles anchored in snow packed firm beneath his weight. The barn roof sagged under ice. Fences leaned. But the house stood warm behind him, and inside it Odessa was brushing stray curls from Ruth's brow as she tucked the girl into a quilt. He didn't watch long. He stepped down, shovel in hand, and started clearing the path from the porch to the stable. Each scrape of metal against ice echoed in the morning hush. By midday, Odessa joined him, her gloved hands gripping a second shovel. She didn't ask permission. She just worked beside him, matching his pace, the sound of her breath steady. "You could be inside," he said, not looking over. "I could," she answered. They worked without speaking after that. It wasn't silence so much as understanding. When the sun sank low, casting pink light across the snowdrifts, they returned to the house. Reed had set the table with 3 tin plates and a chipped mug for himself. He looked up when they entered, then turned back to his task without a word. Odessa removed her gloves slowly and rubbed her hands together near the stove. Yates watched her for a moment, then cleared his throat. "I'll ride into town tomorrow. The cellar's near empty." She nodded. "I'll write a list." He hesitated. "You'll be alone with them." "I know. They don't always listen. I've noticed." He allowed himself the smallest smile. "You manage them better than I did." "I don't manage them," she said, turning to face him. "I just see who they are." Later that night, Yates found her in the sewing chair by the hearth, mending one of his shirts. Her needle moved with quiet precision, thread looping through worn cloth. He stood in the doorway, watching the firelight catch the curve of her cheek. "I never asked what made you answer my letter," he said. Odessa glanced up, the needle paused mid-stitch. "I didn't come west looking for comfort or romance. I came because I wanted something to tend." He stepped closer. "The ranch?" "No. People." She looked at him fully then, her eyes steady. "I lived with my brother and his wife in St. Joseph. They had more money than they knew what to do with, but no room for me. I was useful until I wasn't. So I came here. I thought, maybe someone needed what I had to give. Yates sat across from her, his elbows resting on his thighs. And do we? You do. All three of you. The fire cracked between them. The room felt fuller than it had since his wife's passing, not just with warmth, but with presence. Odessa spoke again, softly. I know grief leaves you wary, but love doesn't wait for the right season. It grows in the cold, too. He leaned forward, his voice low. I felt something shift, Odessa, but I'm not sure how to name it without feeling like I'm betraying what was. You're not replacing her. She folded the shirt into her lap. You're allowing something new. The next morning, Yates hitched the wagon before dawn. Odessa handed him a folded list and a wrapped biscuit for the road. Their fingers brushed as he took them, and she met his gaze with a quiet steadiness. If the road's bad, stay in town, she said. I'll be back before dark. She stepped back, arms crossed against the cold. I trust you. The ride to Hamilton was slow. Snow clung to the trees, branches bowed under its weight. Yates kept the horses at a deliberate pace, eyes sharp for drifts and ice. He reached the general store by mid-morning, greeted with nods and short words. Folks knew him, respected him, but he'd never invited much more. Inside, he handed over the list and waited as the clerk gathered flour, salt, kerosene, and a bolt of muslin Odessa had written down in careful script. New woman's making herself useful, I hear, the clerk said, weighing beans. She is. You plan to keep her? Yates narrowed his eyes. She's not a hired hand. No offense meant. Yates paid without another word. By the time he turned the wagon homeward, the sky had darkened with more snow. The road narrowed, wind picking up. He pressed the horses harder, heart pounding slow and heavy at the thought of Odessa and the children waiting in a house half a day from help. It was near dusk when the roofline came into view. Candles glowed behind the windows. He pulled the wagon into the yard, boots crunching through fresh powder as he carried the supplies inside. Reed ran to take the sack from his arms. Odessa stood at the stove, sleeves rolled, cheeks flushed from heat and effort. You made it, she said. I said I would. She nodded, then turned back to the pot. Wash up. Supper's nearly done. Later, when the children were abed and the dishes dried, he found her near the fire again. She was not sewing this time. Just sitting, hands folded, eyes watching the flames. He walked over, stopped in front of her. I want to do this right. She looked up slowly. You already are. He dropped to one knee, not for show, not out of custom, but because it felt like the only honest way to meet her in that moment. I want you to stay. Not because I need help. Not because the children do. But because I've come to care for you more than I know how to explain. Odessa reached for his hand, her fingers wrapping around his. You don't have to explain it, she said. Just let it be. He kissed her then, without hesitation, with the full weight of a man who'd known loss and chose to open himself again anyway. And she kissed him back, not as a stranger in a new land, but as a woman who had found her place. The last of the snow began to shrink back from the earth by early March, leaving behind patches of mud and brittle grass flattened beneath months of wait. The world outside the Lanton ranch was still pale and raw, but the air carried the first promise of thaw. Inside the house, the rhythms of life had settled into something steady. Odessa stood by the table, rolling out biscuit dough while Reed practiced his sums beside her, tongue pressed to the edge of his lip in concentration. Ruth sat at Odessa's feet, threading dried corn onto a string with the patience only children could summon. Yates entered from the back door, boots damp, hat in hand. Fence on the north end's leaning again, he said. Wood's too soft to hold another season? Odessa dusted flour from her hands. We can pull the old posts and sort what's still sound. I'll help after dinner. Yates tilted his head. You sure? I've hauled worse than fence posts. He watched her for a breath too long, eyes lingering on the way her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, the way her hair came loose at the nape of her neck. She didn't blush or look away. She just held his gaze, steady as ever. That evening, while the children slept upstairs, Yates poured water into the basin and scrubbed the grit from his hands. Odessa sat by the hearth, darning one of Ruth's stockings. The light from the fire caught in her hair, and he felt something pull deep in his chest. "You ever miss Missouri?" he asked, drying his hands. She didn't answer right away. "The river sometimes. The sound of it at night. But not much else." He leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You left family behind?" "My brother, though he's more fond of himself than anyone else. No one I'd go back for." He nodded slowly. "I can't say I miss anyone either. Folks drifted off when she passed." Didn't know what to say, so they said nothing. Odessa looked up. "Grief makes people quiet. Sometimes too quiet. I used to think if I just kept working, just kept moving, I'd stay ahead of it. Did it work?" "No," he paused. "Not until you came." She set down the stocking, stood, and walked over. "You don't owe me anything for staying, Yates. I didn't come for a reward. I know that." He reached out, fingers brushing her wrist. "But I want to give you something anyway. Something lasting." Her breath caught, just slightly. "What would that be?" He stepped closer. "A place that's yours. Not borrowed. Not temporary." He hesitated. "The parlor, we don't use it. I thought you might want it for sewing. Or books. Whatever you need." She blinked, surprised. "You'd give me a room?" "I'd give you the whole house if I thought you'd take it." She looked down, then back up. "You have a way of saying just enough to undo me." He smiled, not broadly, but enough that the lines around his eyes deepened. "You undo me too." They stood there until the fire snapped behind her and she reached up, resting her hand on his chest. He covered it with his own, fingers rough against hers. The following days brought more thaw, and with it, more work. Together, they cleared the garden plot, pulling up winter's dead roots and scattering ash from the hearth to feed the soil. Odessa laughed once when Ruth tried to plant a button in the dirt, and Yates had not heard that sound from her before. It stayed with him the rest of the day. One morning, Odessa approached him as he saddled the mare for a ride to the upper pasture. "Ruth asked today if she could call me Mama." He paused, hand on the saddle strap. "What did you say?" "I told her only if she wanted to. She said she did." Yates looked down at the ground for a long beat. "She never called her real mother that. Not once. She was too little." Odessa stepped closer. "Then maybe it's time she has someone to say it to." He looked up at her, eyes tight with something he hadn't shared before. "You've given them more than I ever could." "No," she said quietly. "You gave them a home. I'm just helping it grow." He leaned in, pressing his forehead to hers. "I don't want to keep calling you wife only in name." "Then don't." That night, after the children had gone to bed, he brought out the ring he'd tucked away since before the snow. It wasn't new, just a plain gold band that had belonged to his mother. He stood in the kitchen doorway, turning it between his fingers, before walking to where Odessa sat by the window, watching the moon rise. "I should have done this earlier," he said, "but I was still holding on to something I needed to let go." She stood, eyes soft. "You're ready now." He reached for her hand. "Odessa Parlow. Would you let me be your husband in truth?" She didn't answer with words. She stepped into his arms, and when he slid the ring onto her finger, her hand didn't shake. They didn't speak as they stood there. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't absence, it was fullness. And when they lay beside each other that night, for the first time sharing the bed that had held too much emptiness for too long, it wasn't hurried or uncertain. It was quiet, like everything else between them. Deliberate, tender, and wholly real. Outside, the snow melted into the earth. The land was softening. So was he, and she was already rooted deep. The first foals were born in April, the ground still cold enough to bite but softening under the weight of longer days. Odessa stood at the paddock rail, watching as Yates leaned into the stall, quiet and patient, guiding the mare's labor with practiced hands. She didn't interrupt. He worked best when left to his rhythm, measured, precise, and calm even under strain. When the colt finally came, slick and trembling in the straw, Yates eased it upright and let the mare draw close, her soft knickers filling the stall. He brushed his forearm across his brow and turned toward the door. Odessa met him with a bucket of water and a cloth already damp. She didn't speak, just reached up and wiped the sweat from his neck, then dipped the cloth again and offered the bucket. He drank, then handed it back. Strong little thing. Might make a fine trail horse one day. She's a filly, Odessa said, nodding toward the stall. Yates glanced back, then shrugged. Still might. They walked together toward the house, boots sinking into thawed patches of earth. The wind had mellowed, and for the first time since autumn, the hills smelled of pine and soil rather than ice and wood smoke. Reed was waiting near the porch, holding a slingshot behind his back. I wasn't aiming at the window, he said as soon as they reached him. Yates raised a brow. What did you hit? The fence post. It splintered, Odessa added, passing Reed with a glance. You'll help sand it smooth after supper. Reed nodded, then sprinted off before either of them could add more. Yates watched him disappear around the side of the house. He's getting tall. He's outgrown 2 shirts this month. Ruth's been stitching the sleeves longer when he sleeps. Inside, the house carried the scent of simmering beans and ash from the morning fire. Ruth sat on the floor near the hearth, her hands busy braiding scraps of cloth into a rug. Odessa moved to stir the pot, tucking a stray curl behind her ear with the back of her wrist. Yates leaned against the doorframe. You ever think about running a school? She turned, wooden spoon still in hand. For the valley? For the house. He nodded toward the children. You've got away with how you teach them. Not just the reading and writing part. All of it. I never thought I'd be teaching again. She set the spoon down. Before I left Missouri, I taught a coal miner's daughter to read hymns. Her father called it a foolishness, but she sang every Sunday after. Yates stepped forward, voice low. You've given them more than knowledge. You've given them steadiness. She met his gaze. And you've given me somewhere to belong. That night, after the children were settled and the fire had burned down to coals, Odessa sat at the table with a small stack of worn hymnals she'd found in the storage trunk beneath the stairs. Her fingers traced the faded ink, the cracked spines. Yates brought over 2 mugs hot water steeped with pine needles and crushed mint. She smiled when he set one in front of her. Is this your idea of courting? I thought I was already past the courting part. Her smile deepened. Then what is this? Trying not to take you for granted. She looked down, thumb brushing the corner of a page. I used to imagine what it'd be like to be chosen. Not just needed, but wanted. You are, he said, sitting beside her. Every day. She turned her head toward him, eyes soft but clear. Would you mind if I planted a lilac by the back fence? He blinked, caught off guard. You want flowers? I want something that will last. Something that grows where it wasn't before. Yates reached across the table, covering her hand with his. Then we'll plant it together. The next morning, they dug the hole side by side. Ruth danced barefoot in the warming grass, and Reed stood watch with a watering pail, serious as a soldier. Odessa lowered the sapling into the dirt, her skirt brushing the ground. Yates pressed the soil around its base, then looked up at her. You think it'll take? With light and patience, she said, brushing dirt from her palms. Most things do. A breeze passed through the yard, stirring the bare branches of the trees and the hem of Odessa's dress. She stepped closer, and he wrapped an arm around her waist, drawing her against him. She rested her cheek to his shoulder. I'm not afraid of the waiting. I'm not either, he said. They stood that way until the sun rose higher, casting their shadows long over the ground where something new had just been planted. By late May, the lilac had taken root. It stood just beyond the back fence, its green leaves fuller by the week, though the blooms would wait for another spring. Odessa opened the kitchen shutters each morning to let in the light, and now, when Yates came in from the fields, he left his boots at the door without being asked. That Thursday, she found a parcel wrapped in brown paper resting beside the flour tin. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a length of calico the color of wild iris, soft to the touch. She held it to her chest, heart rising in a quiet, unexpected way. Was in the mercantile window, Yates said from the doorway, brushing dust from his sleeves. Thought it might suit you. She looked at him, eyes steady. I hadn't said I needed anything. I know, he said. But I wanted you to have it. That evening, she laid the fabric across the table, smoothing its folds. Ruth ran her fingers over it with reverence while Reed asked if it was for Sunday best. No, Odessa said softly. It's for the day I marry your father proper. Yates looked up from where he sat by the stove, a slow breath leaving his chest. You mean it? She met his gaze. I meant it the day I stepped off that train. The next Sunday, they stood beneath the juniper tree behind the house. Ruth holding Odessa's hand and Reed wearing his father's old vest, too big at the shoulders. Their nearest neighbors, the Albrights from 3 ridges over, had come to witness. Mrs. Albright brought a blackberry pie and the family's Bible, its spine worn from years of births and blessings. Odessa wore the calico, sewn into a dress simple and cut, but when she stepped into the light, Yates forgot the words he'd planned. She reached for him, and he took her hand without hesitation. Mrs. Albright cleared her throat, opened the Bible, and read from the page where the corners had curled from use. When she finished, Yates didn't wait. I walked through too many winters thinking the world had nothing left to give, he said, voice low but certain. But you came and you listened. You gave without asking and you stayed. I promise to keep you warm, to carry what's heavy, and to never let the quiet between us turn cold. Odessa's voice was steady. I came west with nothing but my hands and my name. You gave me this land to stand on, these children, a home with walls that hold more than grief. I give you myself all the way through. With a nod from Mrs. Albright, they joined hands and kissed, Ruth clapping before anyone else could. That night, they sat on the porch with coffee gone lukewarm, watching the stars blink out one by one. Odessa's head rested against Yates's shoulder, and his arm curved around her back. The house behind them was still, the children asleep under patched quilts and open windows. You ever think about more? Yates asked, voice quiet. More? She said. Another child? Odessa lifted her head and looked at him. Are you asking because the house feels too quiet? No, he said, because I want to see you carry something we built together. She reached for his hand, fingers curling into his. Then yes. In the months that followed, the land pushed up green again. The wheat stretched taller by the week, and the barn was fitted with a new roof before the first August storm. Reed learned to drive the wagon with 2 hands steady on the reins, and Ruth followed Odessa everywhere, asking questions about baking, stitches, and how to dry herbs from the rafters. By the year's end, Odessa's belly had rounded beneath her apron, and Ruth whispered to the lilac bush each time she passed it, asking for a sister. Yates worked slower now, but more purposefully. He came in before the sun set and left Odessa's tea steeping when she rose in the mornings. They made a cradle from spare pine, smoothed and oiled until it shone. He carved a flower into the headboard, a lilac not yet in bloom. The baby came in the first week of March, just before dawn. Odessa gripped Yates's hand so tightly he thought the bones might crack, but she did not cry out. When the wail came, sharp and new and strong, Yates felt something in his chest unravel and stitch itself back together all in one breath. A daughter. They named her Clara. Ruth held her with reverence, and Reed stood guard beside the bed with the same slingshot now tucked into his belt for show. Odessa leaned back against the pillows, sweat cooling on her brow, and Yates pressed a kiss to her temple. I never thought I'd get to see this again, he said. But now you have. They lay together that night with the baby between them, her breathing soft and even. Yates watched Odessa's eyes drift closed, her hand resting lightly on their daughter's chest. Outside, the lilac bush bent gently in the wind, still waiting its first bloom. But inside the house, there was nothing left to wait for. The walls were full, the silence warm, and the night, at last, was whole.